of like, is it going to be something that I actually like, or is it going to end up kind of failing to grab me the way I want it to? But we'll see. Again, I don't want to hate on it until we try it. But yeah, I was thinking, and this is something I've been thinking about for a while. So thus ends the interlude. We'll probably have like a little bit of time after to do that kind of thing. But yeah, so we kind of have like 2.5 more topics, I guess, is kind of the way I'm thinking about it. So we're going back to tier maker just because it's convenient. Yeah, this will do. So I've been thinking for quite a while about something, and we'll use FF7 and we'll use Final Fantasy VII Remake as examples of this. Action JR. So how do I want to structure this? So I want to talk about, and we won't spend it, this isn't going to be exhaustive. Like, we won't be taking every JRPG and figuring out how they all fit together and whatnot. Like, that's not what we're going to do. But I did want to talk about one interesting aspect of being someone who likes JRPGs, and it's the genre divide within JRPGs. The genre kind of the split, or I don't know if I would call it a split so much as a confusion. It's not necessarily bad. It can just feel a little confusing. So, and I'm thinking about this, and we have Final Fantasy VII Remake. Real time. So we'll do traditional and modern / stylized. And we'll get to all these kind of definitions here. So what is the original Final Fantasy VII? It's a turn-based traditional JRPG, right? Dragon Quest, right? Turn-based, original JRPG. No, nobody's going to contend with you on this. These are turn-based, traditional JRPGs, right? I think it gets interesting when you get Tales, and Tales of Berseria is probably going to end up as kind of a stand-in for the entire Tales franchise here. So there's no question that the Tales franchise is real-time, right? Is a real-time JRPG franchise, right? Like it is basically just an action RPG that's encounter based. And you can kind of see where I'm going with this as we go on. But I would argue it's a traditional JRPG as well. It's, it's not hyper stylized. It's not. There's not a lot that's like super special about it, right? It's just it's a traditional real-time JRPG. In fact, if you want to think about it, in terms of traditional JRPGs, these three franchises, FF, Dragon Quest, and Tales, are the like three horsemen of the apocalypse in this regard, right? Like, they are Japanese role-playing games in terms of franchises, right? So, like, especially Dragon Quest. So, like, you know, I think that's something that's really interesting, right? So, you know, we have turn-based traditional and real-time traditional, right? Persona, where are we putting Persona, right? And we'll have P5 stand in for all of Persona, just because, you know, they're all stylized. Yeah, like, there's not, yeah, I wouldn't say, definitely not real-time combat. There are some, I guess now there's one spin-off that's still kind of an RPG that has real-time combat, but that doesn't count. It's not the main series. It's turn-based. It's a modern JRPG. It's got, like, crazy graphics. It's basically got, like, Sonic-ish music, but, like, even more stylized and, like, genre ridden, and like Persona thrives on style, right? So I think that's and you know, this kind of gets at the heart of my argument, right? Is how do we think about JRPGs? Because I think the only, actually, this is Nier Automata. You know, we'll talk about, we'll put Kingdom Hearts in here as well. But Nier is a modern real-time JRPG, right? It's not encounter-based the way that Tales is, but it's a JRPG. It's got, like, JRPG level mechanics and skill mechanics and stuff. It's super stylized. It's not stylized the way that, like, we typically would think about style, right, in quotation marks, but it's stylized. It's got its own sense of style, and that's why I have, like, modern stylized, because everything has a style. It's just, like, how much is it leaning on that style, right? So yeah, like, Nier Automata, I would say, is a modern, stylized, real-time JRPG. So, you know, we kind of have the five horsemen of the apocalypse here, right? We have Dragon Quest, FF, Tales, Persona, and Nier. I guess Nier Automata is not really one of the horsemen, but it's probably the most famous example, at least in this list, of a modern real-time JRPG, right? And when I say turn-based and real-time, specifically I mean during combat. Because, you know, there are a lot of other things that can go into making a JRPG what it is. But those are, you know, when people talk about JRPGs, they mean one of these two things, that the combat is either turn-based or real-time. So, we'll get to Final Fantasy VII Remake. What's Kingdom Hearts? Right? It's real time, right? Is it a traditional real time JRPG? Right? Is that what it is? It doesn't have cooking. Well, no, it has cooking in Kingdom Hearts 3, but, you know, as a franchise, cooking has not been something that's a part of it. You have stuff like on rails shooters in the middle of it, right? Like, this is a legitimate question. Where does it fit, right? Where does it fit on this? We know it's real time, but it seems kind of caught between the modern stylized. Yeah, and that I think that's a fair perspective. I think it goes somewhere like in the middle here, where it's not quite. There have been many games that have tried turn-based. That's true, right? Well, and you know, some of the games kind of have a. I guess I'm more talking about like core combat and stuff. So like, and on the whole, in the main franchise at least, the Kingdom Hearts series has remained a real-time JRPG. There's like one instance in the main franchise where they tried turn-based, and that is more of an outlier. Yeah. Yeah, so it's yeah, I would say it leans traditional, but you know, I don't think it's maybe as traditional as something like Tales, right? Because Tales is a traditional JRPG in that sense, right? We'll do one more and then we'll get to 7 Remake. Actually, no. I wanna find a place for Final Fantasy 7, because here's the interesting thing, right? We'll use Chrono Trigger and we'll put FF there. Chrono Trigger is turn based, but it's got the active time battle system, right? And this is going to be kind of the crux of the thesis, right? Chrono Trigger is turn based in the sense that, you know, you're waiting for your turn, you select what you're going to do from a menu, right? But it kind of ekes into real time, right? Because of the way that the battle system works, especially if you're playing in the main combat mode of the game. Chrono Trigger kind of edges on being a little bit real time, right? Just like a little bit, not much. It's still very much in the realm of turn-based, right? But it's still got that. You know what I would say about Final Fantasy VII? The original Final Fantasy VII? Basically the same thing, right? Still eking towards that real-time combat, right? And, you know, also a little bit more modern stylized, right? Like, what does the original Final Fantasy VII... What does the original Final Fantasy VII lean on? It leans on its aesthetic, right? It leans on its art direction, and it leans on its music. Like, if this isn't stylized to some extent, right? Right? Like, this is stylish. It's just not stylish the way we tend to think about it, right? It's got, yeah, it's more of like a kind of modern-ish battle theme, right? And it defined a lot of modern battle themes. You can't say the same in that sense, in terms of like how modern it is. You can't say the same about Chrono Trigger, right? And again, it's kind of eking in this direction, right? Yeah, classic, right? That song is a classic. It defined a generation of video games, continues to define generations of video games. So yeah, but it's still like kind of going in that direction, right? And so what I wanted to say about Final Fantasy VII Remake is that over time, I wish Final Fantasy 15 was here, just so I could make a point. The original Final Fantasy 7 is basically just a turn-based JRPG, right? Like, there's not... Like, it's a little bit more real-time than something like Persona or Dragon Quest or Pokemon or something like that, right? But... So it's a real-time JRPG. But I would say it's still traditional. Right? I would still say it's traditional in the way that Tales is. Right? And in the way that Dragon Quest is. Maybe it's a little bit more modern than maybe it's like more sort of in the realm of Kingdom Hearts, because it's using a lot of like modern music, like Hollow is basically just a rock anthem, right? Like, or ballad, I guess. Like, it's using a lot of modern techniques, but it's still largely a traditional JRPG. And so I think the point I'm trying to make is when you're talking about JRPGs, you end up talking about a lot of different things, right? Ys is an action series. It's an action RPG. Very traditional. Right? It's very traditional in the way that it structures itself as a JRPG, right? Whereas I wish the Trails games were on here. But anyways, like, you get my point. Right? Like, tell me if you don't get my point. I think when you're talking about JRPGs, and I think Final Fantasy VII Remake, the reason I'm using it as kind of the crux of my argument is a lot of people will tell you that Final Fantasy has lost its way and that Final Fantasy VII Remake is bad because it's too modern, right? When, in reality, all that happened is they changed the battle system from turn-based to real-time, but it's still basically a traditional JRPG in basically every other sense of the word. And it's not like traditional JRPGs haven't had real-time combat for a really long time, right? Like the Tales franchise pioneered this idea of having real-time combat in a JRPG and have run with it and haven't let it go. But at the same time, you still have traditional turn-based JRPG systems like Persona that have stuck around. And Dragon Quest is the most traditional turn-based JRPG that's out there, and they still exist, right? So I think that, like, and asking for a more nuanced conversation on the internet is something no one should do because it's a pointless thing to do. But I think it is worth noting that Final Fantasy VII Remake is as traditional as it gets, more traditional than Final Fantasy has been since like 8, right? 8 or 9. No, 10. More traditional. No, 9. We'll say 9. We'll say 9 as a base here. Right? Like, if you want to think about the most like middling JRPG in terms of like where it fits on this diagram, you have Final Fantasy 13, which is like caught between trying to be both turn-based and real-time. Is it traditional? Is it going for a more stylized look? Like if I had to place it, I'd say it's like here, which basically puts it nowhere, right? Like sometimes, Chrono Trigger is great. I love Chrono Trigger. So, sometimes you can get away with being a little bit more middling and like kind of caught between two worlds. But Final Fantasy 13 really suffers, I think, from trying to be this like hybrid real-time turn-based thing and also not quite knowing what style it wants to go for in terms of like, are we going to be more traditional about it or are we going to be more modern and stylized about it? So, and a lot of people like 13, so I'm not going to say too much about 13 here, but like I think I want to save this just so I have this to like talk to people about, because this is kind of the thing where I think when you're talking about a Japanese role-playing game, I think it's helpful to keep in mind that JRPGs are very diverse in their pool, and I don't say that to say that like you can't define them as a JRPG. I do think, though, that when you're talking about them in broad strokes, it's helpful to frame it in such a way that recognizes the direction that it's taking. So is it taking a turn-based traditional direction? Is it taking a real-time but traditional direction? Are you taking a real-time but stylized or turn-based and stylized, right? So, yeah, I wanted to talk about that because I've had it on my mind for a while. So I wanted to talk about that and make it, and just kind of have a recording of it so I can, just have it around and, iterate on it, because this is probably something that I'll keep thinking about. And have more discussions about over time. But yeah, just thinking about that and thinking about this kind of thing and why Final Fantasy VII Remake was kind of received the way it was from a gameplay perspective, right? Because if you ask me, it's a lot more like a Tales game than a traditional FF game, even though it's still traditional, right? It's still in the realm of Final Fantasy VII, right? It's just not. It just has a completely different combat system. So yeah, so that's that. That's our. That is.